But I'm going to go ahead and start the recording. So again, for anyone, if you miss any of the information in the PowerPoint, it will be up on Brightspace. Likewise, I'm going to start off with some announcements that will have some hyperlinks in it as well in the information I'm giving you. So you can access those through the PowerPoint that'll be up on Brightspace after we meet today. So as expected, we've got people logging in right now, and we'll get started here in just a second. Okay, so let me get, here we go. I'm gonna share my screen. Welcome everyone to Workshop 3. If you don't have it out already, please go ahead and pull out your direct and indirect worksheet. Looks like this actually, I'm not sure if I'm showing my, you stop sharing for a second and select the other option for share so that I can share a screen instead of sharing. There we go. So can I get a thumbs up from somebody if you're seeing the direct versus indirect worksheet? Okay, great. So if you don't have this out, go ahead and grab it. We're going to go into that here in a couple of minutes after I do some announcements. But I am going to go ahead and pull back up the PowerPoint and we'll go through this just to get started. So some announcements. We have a number of different programs kicking off right now offered through Silmar. The first one is the Silmar Writing Group. This is for anyone who's doing any kind of research or writing related to intercultural competence or intercultural learning. We have a writing group to support that. It's led by my colleague, Dr. Lan Jin. She's a senior intercultural research specialist. So her primary role is supporting faculty and staff across Purdue in conducting research in intercultural competence. And of course, writing going along with that and helping to find publications and get published. So if you are interested in maybe writing up some of your research or the data that you're going to be collecting through your program this semester or next semester, I should say, you might reach out to her and you might consider joining the writing group. These meetings are hosted through Teams, so they're virtual. You can join from your office, but it's a chance to interact with other faculty and staff who are doing similar research, share ideas, and just help support one another in writing and research. The first session is going to be the 27th from 2 to 4. There's a whole calendar here. And again, we do have a website for the writing group, but you can also reach out directly to Dr. Lan Jin. Here's her email address is here as well. The next one is our worldview workshops. So if you're wanting to work a little bit more on your own intercultural development, this is a program that we offer to faculty and staff that focuses specifically on the intercultural competencies, a lot of which we're going to be talking about today. But the workshops are just this opportunity to work through some of these intercultural activities that focus on the different competencies and have discussions around them. So if you want some more kind of hands-on first-person perspective of diving into this intercultural competence training and working on your own intercultural development, this is a great way to do that and also kind of build a community around intercultural competence. The first one of these is on the 15th. So that is going to be this Thursday at 10:30 a.m. So even if you're planning on attending workshop 4, it still won't conflict with that if you're available, of course. The first 5 workshops are done via Zoom, but then the 6th one is asynchronous and it's offered through Brightspace, and you'll be able to take part in that kind of during that week of October 17th through the 21st. Anyone who completes all 6 will get a certificate of completion for worldview workshops. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend you reach out to Dr. Aletha Stahl, another one of my colleagues, and she is also a senior intercultural learning specialist. And you may even want to reach out to her to discuss her portable intercultural modules. So those are existing modules of instruction for various subjects of intercultural competence, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging that she has created. And the nice thing about what we call them PIMS, the Portable Intercultural Module. The nice thing about these PIMS is that you can just import them into your existing Brightspace course page that you have for whatever class you're teaching, and the students can engage with that either separately on their own, or they can engage with it and then come back as a class and discuss it with you facilitating those conversations. So that might be something else you want to speak to Aletha about as well. There's websites for each of these programs. There's a website for the writing group. There's a website for Worldview Workshops as well. And then the last announcement is about PickleCop. This is our Purdue Intercultural Learning Community of Practice. We had been offering the PickleCop for years, but during the pandemic, it kind of went on hiatus. We also here at Silmar downsized a little bit staffing wise, and we're finally building back up and getting to a point where we can begin to offer some of these programs again. This one is, in comparison to Worldview Workshops, which is much more about actually working through intercultural competence, this is looking at it from a perspective of being a facilitator. So a lot of times the workshops will have guest speakers come in and present a particular activity or the research that they're working on to kind of expand your knowledge base about what's possible in the realm of intercultural competence. The first event coming up is the Life of PIM, and this is going to highlight one of the PIMs that are available. This is the, and so it's a hands-on introduction to the portable intercultural modules with both Aletha and Dr. Laura Starr from the College of Science. So they're going to be introducing one of the PIMs and go through how they use it with students. And it's a great way to learn about PIMs and get an introduction to that as well. And that will be September 20th from 2:30 to 4. Website information is here. You would need to register for PickleCop, and there's a calendar to register for those specific sessions. Any questions about our announcements, any of the programs that I'm sharing today? I'll put up more information in announcements in our Brightspace, making them available, all this information available to you. But of course, again, they'll be available through this PowerPoint, which will be posted up within Module 3 in Brightspace. Okay. So our agenda for today, we're going to start with our intercultural learning activity number 3. That's the direct indirect worksheet. And then we're going to look at the AAC&U rubrics. There's more than one that we're going to discuss. We'll talk about building custom rubrics, and then from that moving into how we can use these to select competencies as outcomes. So that's why we're looking at rubrics first. And this workshop is focusing on learning outcomes, and rubrics are a great source of identifying and even customizing learning outcomes for your particular program. And then finally, we're going to look at alignment of outcomes, because we want our intercultural learning outcomes to align with your disciplinary learning outcomes for your particular programs. And as always, we'll end with a Q&A session, allowing some room for discussion there as well. So we're going to get into activity 4. And the competency that we're focusing on here primarily, and I say primarily because oftentimes we have more than one competency that comes into play. Primarily, we're going to be looking at verbal, nonverbal communication. So again, reading from right to left instead of left to right. Capstone is the highest proficiency level for verbal, nonverbal communication. This is one of the skills under the intercultural knowledge and competency value rubric. So the capstone level articulates a complex understanding of cultural differences in verbal and nonverbal communication, demonstrates understanding of the degree to which people use physical contact while communicating in different cultures, or use direct, indirect, and explicit, implicit meanings, and is able to skillfully negotiate a shared understanding based on those differences. And that final phrase is particularly important, because we want to develop this skill of negotiating a shared understanding, and in particular, cross-culturally from one culture to another. So for this communication activity, I'm going to put you all into breakout rooms once again. And for this, you're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes to respond to these questions. Now, when you go into your breakout rooms, you're going to lose sight of this PowerPoint slide. So I will point out that I've posted these 3 questions down at the bottom on Brightspace in the Meet submodule. So if you want to have these questions handy, you can certainly take a screenshot real quick, pull out your phone, snap a picture of it, or you can just pull up the Brightspace unit or module 3 and then go to the Meet submodule and you'll see them posted there as well. So during your session, are you more of a direct or indirect speaker? How do you feel when you communicate with someone who's the opposite in communication style? And are there times when you switch? So share your responses, how you filled out that worksheet. And also, as you're discussing those, share kind of your rationalization behind why you chose direct or indirect, and then how you did the code switching. Kind of explain that rationale, and then cover these 3 questions. And as usual in these breakout sessions, you'll get a little timer in the last minute telling you to wrap up, and then we'll come back for our larger group discussion. So bear with me a moment while I set these up. And, oh, I need to already kind of mess that up. I have to set the number of rooms based on, let's see, what, I think I want 5 rooms here. And bear with me as I move you into these rooms, because again, I do want to make sure I get certain people in there. Why is it? Sorry, I'm having a little struggle with getting these set up. Okay. And don't click on anything just yet. Well, I'll have to move people in. Okay. Let me move. Let's do it this way. Okay. Oops, did I lose somebody? To move. Here's my keys in 3.
Could you just put me with my key?
Yeah, I just moved you in. You should get a thing popping up.
Okay.
Did you get it?
Mm-mm.
No. Let me try again. I'm going to move you to another room and then move you back. Anything popping up now? Yep. Great. Okay. Well, that was fun. Let's see. Okay, a few more seconds and everybody should be coming back to join us. Welcome back, everyone. So if everybody still has that worksheet, I just want to real briefly touch on a few of these items. So why don't we start with, let's go ahead and get in a fishbowl. We've got a pretty good sized group today. So let's get in a fishbowl, and I'm just going to call some people. Hopefully I'm not going to call on the same people that I did last time. If I do call on someone who was in fishbowl last time, just let me know and I'll select somebody else from each group. Let me have Murish and Victoria and Mikey and Janine and Brian. And if everyone else would go to their video and stop video. And again, if you need to go into video settings and uncheck or check the box that says hide non-video participants, and that will get you a view that only shows the people in the fishbowl.
Dan, I was in the fishbowl last time. I don't mind doing it again. Just letting you know. People are sick of hearing me.
Thank you for telling me. Let's see, Andrew, if you're available. I don't remember if Andrew was in last time or not.
I was.
You were. I think that's where I got hooked up, because I think all three of you in your group were in fishbowl last time. Brian, if you don't mind staying, we'll let people hear from you again. I have to mix up my groups a little bit more, I think. Or maybe I overmixed. I don't know. So first of all, let's get at least one or two of these examples. I'd like to hear from you all as far as which one you selected it as being, each of these statements as direct or indirect, and then what your code switch was, and a little bit about the why. So we'll start with that first one. It is cold in here. Would somebody like to volunteer? Is this a direct statement or an indirect statement?
Dan, first of all, I don't mind going first, but I think if you stop sharing your screen, we can see.
Yeah, because I can't see everyone. I just see the black screen.
Yeah. It's still sharing. I thought I had it paused. Sorry.
Oh,
Okay.
there it is.
That's better. Thank you for pointing that out. I don't always know what you guys are seeing. Sometimes it's
Okay.
slips my mind there. So again, it's cold in here. Janine,
I felt that was a really direct statement. And the code switch actually was kind of a great one shared by one of my colleagues in the room. I think I should have brought a sweater.
okay. Yeah, good. How about, did somebody have it's cold is here and it's cold in here? Indirect.
This is Mikey. I think that the code switch itself, you could change it to is anyone cold in here? Make it a question.
Absolutely.
Rather than just a statement. I think that could change the perspective of it. Because obviously the person who's asking is cold, but you could ask it as a question. Is anyone cold in here? So I think that could be more direct.
Yeah. Did anybody have this as an indirect statement? It's cold in here? And maybe
Yeah, I had it as indirect because I felt like someone saying, "Oh, it's cold in here." It's like, okay, so what do you want to happen? Like, okay, what am I supposed to do with this information? And I think I put a more direct comment was, please turn off the AC.
That's a really great one. Yeah, yeah.
I did it indirect as well. I thought it was like I made it snarky. Is anyone paying the electricity bill?
Nice. I like that one. That's good. Okay, let's do one more. Let's do number 3. I will try my best to get that done on time. Does someone have that as a direct statement?
We for the most part, agreed that was indirect. Although it could be interpreted either way. We discussed a little bit, but the will try was the portion, because the person stating that probably has in their head, there's a high likelihood I will get this done on time or I won't. So yeah, we switched it to a direct that I will have that done tomorrow on time.
Okay. Yeah, so the try part becomes the indirect, kind of softening the done on time part. Okay. Did anybody have the opposite? Everyone interpreted this one as indirect. Okay. So let's go to those three questions that I gave you all to discuss. Are you more of a direct or indirect speaker? Janine, I'll start with you.
I am a direct speaker.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. I was sharing with the group that I think over time I've learned to temper my directness, but I tend to ask for what I want and listen and know when to do it. But yeah, I'm pretty direct about it.
Okay. How do you feel when you communicate with someone who is more indirect?
Over time, I think again, I've become better at this. It used to make me feel so impatient. I happen to have a daughter that is very indirect. She goes all around the world to ask you a question. And a lot of times when she was younger, I'd be like, that could have been said in like 3 seconds and you took an hour. So um, I I would say used to be very impatient. I think now I've learned to kind of build an environment around me where I let people be themselves.
Yeah.
And so that's required me to develop patience
Yeah.
to just let people talk and get it out. But it also has made me a better listener. So now I learn more. But yeah, I think I'm fine now when people are opposite.
Great. Thanks, Jenny.
Hmm.
Mikey, how about you? Are you direct or indirect?
Really, I think deaf people as a whole, here in America or in other countries, we're very strongly direct people. Just from, situations with hearing people or in our life, we've just become, I think with hearing people, a lot of times you're very indirect, and deaf people just want that information. We want to get the point across. We want to solve the problem or, make something happen or so I think it's just naturally enveloped in us that we, have these situations and we want them to be direct. So we just ask and answer direct questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you feel when you communicate with hearing people who are maybe more indirect than the average?
I think I'm very patient. I grew up in a hearing family, so I'm able to be patient and understanding. And I have a soft heart. I feel like I'm very sympathetic for people. So if they just want to, beat around the bush for an hour, then or maybe if I don't know what their point is, I'll kind of ask them some questions, adding a little bit of that direct communication in there. But I do feel like, again, I'm very patient, so I'm fine with dealing with that.
Thanks for sharing that. I especially like the part where you shared that sometimes you'll ask very direct questions to fill in any blanks you might have. That's a really great strategy working across that style, direct to indirect. So thanks for sharing that one. Marish, how about you?
Oh, terribly indirect. Yeah, the Irish are notorious about being like, we kind of say so many words and say nothing at the same time. It's really quite something. Just like, a normal person would say, do you want to get a cup of coffee? And we'll say, well, maybe it might be a good idea to maybe think about perhaps having a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. So yeah, I would say I'm pretty indirect about. Oh, and I'm the youngest of 4 boys in a family. So wants and needs were not necessarily recognized. So probably indirect as well in that sense.
I can sympathize with that. I'm the youngest boy and 3 boys, but I have a younger sister. Thankfully, that's a saving grace there.
Right.
So how do you feel when you communicate and being an international coming to the United States with all these direct, blunt Americans, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I think it was jarring at the beginning when I originally moved here. I thought that, especially when I was like younger in my 20s, when I was in grad school, and I'd be talking to people and they'd be like, just like very straight to the point. And I'd be thinking to myself, like, is this person maybe upset with me about something, or is there something I don't know, or maybe I've said something that offends them? Just very, just direct. Even in partnerships, I have a tendency to like date people who are like very direct, whereas I am in turn kind of indirect. So there's a funny kind of tension there as well. So, but yeah, definitely jarring coming in. I did my undergraduate in Canada, so not so much with the Canadians, or rather not with living where I was, but rather when I came to the United States. So there was definitely a kind of a culture shift, I feel like.
Yeah. And we could unpack similarities between Canadian nice and Midwest nice. And
Yes.
You get into that. I think Midwest we're a little bit more indirect than maybe some of the other parts of the United States. Certainly more than like New York and Boston, where they're very, very direct. So
Right.
Thanks for sharing that perspective. Brian, how about you? Direct or indirect?
I can say with 100% confidence, I'm indirect.
Okay.
But it's kind of interesting to think about it as we're speaking here. I think I would be categorized as concisely indirect. If I wanted a cup of coffee, I wouldn't say I want a cup of coffee, and I wouldn't use a lot of words to get it. I would just say coffee sounds good or something like that, as opposed to saying directly what I really want. So I'm concise, but I'm definitely indirect.
Right. Yeah. And thank you for pointing that out, because there's a lot of different ways to be direct and there's a lot of different ways to be indirect. And certainly a shorthand for those is how many words you're using. So people who are direct tend to use less. People who are indirect tend to use more, but they crisscross sometimes depending on what the message is.
And it depends on the situation too.
Exactly.
As we discussed quite a bit, there's certain situations like when we're teaching, lecturing, where we're as educators, we're direct for the most part. And by we, I mean in our group or myself. But
So how about you? How do you feel working across these two styles with someone who's much more direct than you?
I don't mind either one, but it was interesting when I was reading the background in this. I never thought about these forms of communication like everyone else here probably has, and how I interact with it. But the example said that a lot of indirect people do see that as more rude in certain situations, and I do think that sometimes. So I agreed with that comment. But I mean, obviously it's important. I appreciate being direct in most situations. There's just certain situations, particularly if you're around people you don't know and you're more direct. To me, it comes off as more rude without getting kind of an idea of who's in the audience.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Victoria, direct or indirect?
I would say at times I can be both, but 9 times out of 10, I'm more indirect, especially with like my colleagues and students, because I don't want to hurt people's feelings. So I try to like think about what I'm saying before I'm saying it. But I feel like sometimes that can cause confusion.
Mhm.
Like there's like gray area in a sense.
Right. So how do you feel about working across the opposite?
So I was telling my group, when I'm like interacting with people who are more direct, sometimes I can feel like uncomfortable around them because they're just so blunt. Like I can feel kind of awkward. And if they're talking to someone, else, I can feel uncomfortable for the other person that is receiving their directness.
Mhm.
I don't know. That's something I need to work on. And this assignment kind of made me do a lot of reflection. Like I need to be more direct in certain areas.
Yeah. So you guys are hitting all the right spots. I mean, I know we've got this worksheet and it gives us a lot of information, but you guys are hitting all the main points. Oftentimes people who are more direct may be perceived as rude by those who prefer indirect style. Whereas going the other direction, people who are more indirect may seem to be beating around the bush or confusing, or maybe you're wasting my time. So it's a different kind of rude, right? So how we interpret those it's based on our own preferences, but ultimately we're going to get back to the big C. It's culture. It's how we're raised. Some of you might have been those of you who are direct communicators might have been raised with this saying of say what you mean and mean what you say, right? Or don't beat around the bush, get to the point. You might be raised with those kinds of sentiments, and that dictates our communication style. So there's a couple different things at play when we talk about direct and indirect communication styles. And you have all hit on a very important part, which is we all do direct and we all do indirect, and it depends on the context, who we're talking to, what the situation is, and what we're trying to communicate will determine which form we use. And it is a spectrum. There are different degrees of directness and different degrees of indirectness. But there's two things at play. One is relationships, right? So is it a hierarchy or egalitarian culture? So do I need to show respect to this person and not be so direct that it's imposing upon their authority? Or, the other side of this coin is, what information do I have and what information do I need? And so for that, we have two categories as well that align with direct and indirect, and that is high context cultures and low context cultures. So if there's a high context, that means you already walking into the room, meeting the person, you already have a lot of information about how this particular communication is supposed to go, what the expectations are, what the understandings between the two of you are before you even say the first word in a high context culture. So therefore, that frees you up to be much more indirect and focus on the relationship and how you're communicating. But if you're from a low context culture, you don't have that information. You need to spell everything out literally, explicitly, so that there's no gaps in that information. And that's really what we're talking about when we are making choices about how direct or indirect we want to be, as well as how we perceive the opposite to be rude or not. It has a lot to do with, I already have this information, right? So let's focus on relationships. So if you're being blunt, maybe that is implying that you don't value our relationship. Or on the other end, I need this information. I need you to be efficient in your communication. And if you're not, maybe also relationship wise, maybe you don't respect my time, or you're more concerned with hearing yourself talk, right? So all of these come into play as we're having these communications across different styles. And sure, there are dominant preferences among cultures, but if we recognize that everybody can move along the spectrum in different contexts, that at least should give us some confidence that we are capable of shifting, but we need to practice. So,
Dan, can I ask a question?
absolutely.
Do you think that tone plays a role in whether something is perceived, whether it's direct or indirect, as rude or confusing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you remember back to the slide that talked about verbal, nonverbal communication, it certainly talked about physical, bodily communication, and touch can often be used, but tone absolutely comes into play. Anyone who studied Mandarin, for example, will know that tone can completely change the meaning of a word, not only a phrase or a sentence, but even within English, whether if you're being sarcastic or different ways that you can intonate a phrase, absolutely can change the same sentence from being direct to indirect, or vice versa. So absolutely. So the thing to share about that worksheet, every one of those statements can be direct and every one of them can be indirect. And it's just how we receive them. And that reveals a little bit about what our preferences are. But we also have to kind of introduce some context to it as well.
Mikey has something to say, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Definitely, I agree that it depends on people's experience growing up, or your communication style personally, if you're direct or indirect as a person. But I am curious on number 2, on the worksheet. With no context prior, I'm not sure if it's direct or indirect for number 2. I just want to know what you guys think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll reserve my response, and if anybody has a thought on this. Can we imagine both?
Yeah, I was telling my group I felt like this was more indirect, because I say this oftentimes when I have no idea what the person's talking about, and I don't want them to have to keep explaining to me. And so I'll just say, "Oh, that sounds great. That's amazing," and I have no idea what they're talking about. So I feel like a more direct statement would be and you explain X for me, showing that you may not understand what they're saying and what they're saying isn't clear to you.
Great, Victoria. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Sharing.
Well, that one's kind of a difficult one, because what if the person stating it really did think the proposal was good and there was no further? So I made it more direct by saying the proposal is clear and complete.
Yeah.
I don't know if that-
If you can imagine a very indirect culture, and I often go to East Asian cultures, we understand your proposal very well. If you're the boss and you say that, you might read between the lines. What is he not saying, or he or she not saying? They're not saying, this is a very good proposal. This is a proposal we're going to move forward on. He or she is not saying that. They're saying, we understand your proposal. And the implication, the actual direct message might be, I don't like this. Try again. Right? So it depends. And you're absolutely right, Mikey. It depends on the context. Right? Context matters with everything, really. Okay, so and please, if you all have further comments or questions, don't hold back. But I do want to do a debrief of this and wrap us up at least by the hour. And I did want to note, Andrew asked about, can I give an example of high context culture? I want to go to the chat. So high context would be some of those East Asian cultures where there are a lot of kind of even ritual and ceremonial prescriptive rules about how you interact with people, especially hierarchically, who your boss is or who you're subordinate to. There's a lot about how you're allowed to communicate information. So a lot of times in American culture, we might say, oh, I have this great idea. I want to propose this, project. And we would just go to our, make a meeting with our boss, sit down with them, or in the staff meeting, bring it up. But in the business setting in, say, Japan, there's maybe a process of, may I have a few minutes to share an idea that I had? And it's usually presented as, this is, this is probably not something that would work. And you have to find a lot of different ways to kind of undercut yourself, to kind of lower yourself down and say, this may be a bad idea, but I thought I would share it anyway. And so there's, I'm not well versed in Japanese culture. I only have a kind of a vague understanding of it, but it's this general sense that you don't want to say something too directly, because in that culture, you're going to come off as rude, as thinking you're hierarchically more than you are, that you're stepping outside the bounds of your role in that particular culture. Also, Andrew, you asked about worldview workshops. I'm going to post up a blurb from the site. It is specifically for faculty and staff. So I'm going to share that information, and not for students, unfortunately. Okay, so I do want to debrief the direct versus indirect. So how do we feel going through this? Filling out the worksheet. Let's start from that. How do we feel as we were filling out the worksheet? Janine, how did you feel? Oh.
I thought about, wow, some of this does feel a little sharp, and some of it just is a little ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
So again, just whether you classify it as direct or indirect, I think perspective definitely impacted that.
Yeah. Mikey, how did you feel filling out the worksheet?
I felt like it was pretty simple. It didn't require, a lot of time to answer the questions, but there was still a lot of things to think about, specifically about communication style, and how they both indirect and direct can be a little bit soft. And, practicing that understanding of different perspectives is important, whether you're a direct or indirect person at all. But again, it's good to have the context of the whole situation to have a better understanding of who you're communicating with, and, same thing with other people in other countries.
Yeah, great. So context is always going to play a major role. And one of the things that I like about this particular worksheet is that because it removes context, that forces us to bring our style, our perspective to that as we're interpreting it, and hopefully gets us to reflect on ourselves as well as we're doing that, about why we choose to communicate the way we do. So I'm going to skip over question number 2, what happened? Again, typically when I use this debriefing method, especially with students, so kind of putting on my teacher hat for a minute, going through that what happened process with them is just, it's not meant to be a trick question. It's just lay out what were the steps you took as you went through this, and you went into breakout rooms and everyone shared their responses. I find this really valuable with students sometimes, not always, it may pull out something that if we didn't go through the what happened step by step, they might gloss over something that they did that might be relevant to the conversation. So as far as how they filled out the worksheet, how they had the conversation with peers in small groups. But I'm going to go to, what did you learn? What did you all learn through this worksheet and through your small group conversations and even this group? And at this point, I do want to briefly remind everyone outside the fishbowl, if you have a comment, feel free to turn on your microphone and jump in.
For me, it was a time for like self-reflection. And I realized that I'm extremely indirect when I need to be more direct in certain situations, and not be so passive to come off as nice, and that being direct isn't always rude. It's where are you coming from? And like Janine had said, like the tone of voice, the tone that I'm using when I'm being direct, I think can kind of like set the mood.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I feel like I had a tendency when I was reading through all 5 of them, my immediate reaction was that most of them, if not all of them, were direct. And my impulse every single time was to make them more indirect and make them more obtuse. Now, I don't know what that says about me, but that's what I learned. And also every single word, and I think the tone comment was really useful. Just like when somebody says the same sentence that you're reading out loud in their own voice, you hear it in a totally different way, even if they're saying it at the same pace, same intonation, everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I often think of text messages. Wait, did I understand that the way they meant me to understand that? Or am I? Yeah. So thanks for that, Mush.
I'll jump in and just say this. I wanted to kind of highlight one because I was telling my group that it felt just shady to me, and it would matter so much the tone. Number 3, when they say I will try my best to get that done on time. Typically, if I'm asking someone's help on something, it is important that the task is done, because I tend to not ask for help very often. So I can't deal with the word try too well. So I would watch probably the body language. Is this a try like I'm overwhelmed, I can't do it and I might get to it? Is this a try I'm really not going to do it? Or is this a try I'm really going to try to do it? All of those would matter to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I would like to mention something, if
Yes.
there is a few seconds. Well, I was mentioning in my group that on the one hand, it's like in the second sentence, we understand your proposal very well. To me meant I don't like it or I don't agree with that. So it's something that I noticed coming from the Latin American culture. We tend to be more indirect. I mean, if we and then it was shocking to me when I came to this country and the letter says, please present your papers by Thursday. Okay, where in Spanish, would you please be so kind, if it's not too much for you to present your paper? It is more elaborated, so it's an indirect way. But I found something with these exercises, well, something that I already knew. This type of hidden messages, like it precisely, we understand your proposal very well. Now I know, but that I don't agree or I don't like it. That I would be happy if it will be another scenario or just coming to this country. Oh, they understand my proposal, but no, the problem is they don't like it or they don't agree with it. But I still have problems because I don't read between the lines. I like to be crystal clear. I try to be direct, not indirect like in the Latin American or Mexican style with so many words to almost to forgive me for living for asking you this, but I try to be like the American way. That's the way I know. But at the same time, there are so many hidden sentences or messages between the lines, and I get in trouble for that. But I learn more about this to be kind of knowing in English what direct or indirect means. And I mentioned it to my group as well that I used to have a visiting scientist from Japan. And when I asked him to do something, he said, oh, it's possible. Okay. So then I said, okay, that's great. So, but then a week later, I said, where is the data? I said, it's possible. Yeah, so what have you done? And then he explained to me that it's possible in Japanese, or in Japan means no. And I'm like, what? So then there are those kind of sentences that I don't know how we are going to learn quickly or over the time, but definitely I'm still learning about the American language, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But this exercise did help me.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. That's a wonderful example. You know, this is where there's so many ways to, have conflict and mistakes and misunderstandings in communication. We already disagree just as people on a lot of different topics. I'm on side A and you're on side B and we disagree with one another. But there's also those conflicts that often frequently they come up all the time. I'm on side A and you're on side A, but the way we communicate, we're misunderstanding each other, and that can generate conflict as well. So, being aware of that, and this leads to our next question. How does this relate to the real world? You've done this activity, you've looked at how these statements can be viewed as both direct and indirect. It depends on the context. What does this tell you about not only your personal lives, but we can also put on our teacher hats and start talking about our programs and our students going to different countries and different cultures that may favor one communication style over the other. So how does an activity like this relate to that, or how does it inform that, or would it be useful with your students? What do you all think?
Well, I just related something that just happened today with the way I communicated. I had a new graduate student ask if he could meet me today to discuss something. And I said, well, I'll be watching a research seminar between 11 and 12, but you can come then if you want, or I'm free at 12:30 or 2:30. He came during the research seminar, and I know I acted a little perturbed that he came and interrupted the research seminar, even though I told him to do that. So it makes me think about those interactions with graduate students. I do interact a little more direct and indirect with certain ones based on their kind of personalities and how receptive they are. But I never really thought of it in this level of detail, the way I'm doing it. And I know I need to do better for the example I just gave and other reasons. But yeah, I think I could apply it quite a bit to particularly my graduate student training.
These are all really great examples, and you guys are already really fantastic at this. I don't want this experience with this activity to get anyone's hopes or expectations too high when we do this with students, because keep in mind, they're going to be coming at this from a different experience level. So I do want to set your expectations for doing an activity like this with your students appropriately. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the rest of the questions, but as we do multiple intercultural activities through the 6 workshops that you all will be attending, hopefully we'll get to hit on each of these I'm going to be frequently using the Tiagi debriefing method. It is my favorite, and it can be used in a lot of different ways. It can be very effective. Thank you again to everyone in the fishbowl. I'll try to get more variety in participants so we get people to have more experience with us. And as we get comfortable with something like the Tiagi debrief, I may give some of you the opportunity to lead one of these debriefs using the Tiagi method for one of our intercultural activities. So be ready for that. Okay, everyone else, if you want to turn your cameras back on, you can come join the rest of us back in here visually. But I am going to move ahead. We're going to go on to looking at the AACU rubrics in the time that we have left. So when we're trying to identify learning outcomes, there are a few things we need to think about. How do we narrow our focus, right? How do we get to that? What is that thing we want our students to learn, right? The broad course program goals and objectives down to individual learning outcomes. And then how do we determine what our students need? Many of you commented on this in the discussion boards, the struggle with knowing where your students are and having students at different proficiency levels, right? So how do I set a learning outcome for this group of students that may be at a lower level than this group of students? How do I address both their needs? It's really challenging. So, as with a lot of things that we do instructionally, sometimes we have to kind of teach to the lowest proficiency level or the lowest common denominator and hope through the conversation, those who are at a higher level still get challenged enough to move them up as well. What's an appropriate number of learning outcomes? I get this question a lot going through and drafting an intercultural learning action plan. How many learning outcomes do I need to have? And I'll give you the easy answer for this is, for me, just one. But it's really up to your program and what your needs are, what you want your students to be able to do at the end of your program. That's what we're really trying to figure out when we're selecting learning outcomes. But I will tell you, for many, if not all of you, you're entering into intercultural competence for the first time, or maybe you've had some experience, but you're not feeling really confident. Certainly selecting one is enough. Yeah, don't die on your own sword by selecting 3 or 4 learning outcomes. It can be quite overwhelming. Embedding one learning outcome can be quite robust depending on the assessment activities that you choose. So let's take a look at one of these rubrics. How can I use this to identify a learning outcome? So there's a couple different things I want to look at here. One is the specific competency, right? So in the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric, they've divided it into 3 categories. Knowledges, so that's self-awareness and worldview frameworks. Then there's skills, empathy, and communication. And then attitudes, curiosity, and openness. Okay. So even just starting from that categorization level, so do I want them to increase knowledge? Do I want them to increase skills? Or do I want them to increase their attitudes, right? So that's something to consider. And then from there, you can narrow it down further. So if it's attitudes, do I want them to focus on being more curious, asking more questions as a way to investigate and interrogate that other culture and learn more? Or do I want them to increase their openness? Maybe I feel like my students are kind of holding back or closed off and aren't, stepping outside their comfort zone enough. I want them to be a little bit more, or maybe they're just judgmental. Maybe they're just, my culture is right and the other culture is wrong. So how do I get them past that to be a little bit more open? And then looking at this rubric, we also have 4 different levels of proficiency. So what level of proficiency in a particular competency do I want them to attain? So narrowing in that way can help us get to a specific square on this rubric. And then from that, we can define what the learning outcome is. So just randomly to select level 3 attitudes begins to initiate and develop interactions with culturally different others, begins to suspend judgment in valuing his or his interactions with culturally different others. So that can be a learning outcome by itself, or you can take that language and customize it a little bit more specifically to your discipline or to your program, the location you're going to. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. You can just use it as is, or you can customize it somewhat. So in addition to that rubric, there's also Deerdorf's pyramid, and this is where she set particular competencies as foundational and to be other competencies to be built on as students progress. So she recommends starting with openness and curiosity. So starting with the attitudes in order to get to knowledge and comprehension and skills. And so you'll notice that these things do align with that value rubric, but she's placed it in a hierarchy of needs of what they need, students need to be able to do before they progress to the next competency. That's another way to look at it. Doesn't necessarily have to be the one you use. And perhaps depending on the program you're leading, you may want to focus on something else earlier than what is described here in this pyramid model. But this is, again, one way to address learning outcomes. So the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric is the rubric that we're going to be focusing on throughout this training workshop series. It is the one that I'm going to have everyone select from for their specific action plan. However, there are other learning rubrics out there. Certainly within the AAC&U, there are 15 other rubrics, and I'll introduce some of those here as well. But there's also diversity and inclusion, multicultural affairs is included here. There's a lot of different frameworks out there that you can go to add on and enhance the intercultural competence that you're sharing. One thing that we're trying to do in Silmar is move beyond that building up attitudes, knowledge, and skills, which is definitely very valuable, but moving it from that space into action and application, getting them to move into more of a, to borrow from diversity and inclusion, that inclusion component and social justice and service learning and public service, and becoming a part of a community and applying those intercultural skills. So that's where we're trying to move. So we're frequently adding in some of these other models as well. Again, if you're new, this may be a little bit more advanced. You may want to build up to this, but I do want you all to be aware that looking to other rubrics, global learning is very closely aligned with intercultural competence. So there's a lot of overlap there with the AAC&U rubrics, but also integrative learning. I encourage you to look to those, but don't feel obligated to include those in your action plan.
Daniel?
Yes.
Question. So I noticed on the previous screen you mentioned that the reconsidering the inclusion of diversity in the curriculum through the Association of American Colleges and University. And I happen to serve on the UCC for the College of Agriculture.
Mhm.
And that's something we're working through right now. As you look at those different learning outcomes and what we need to accomplish, one of the things I wonder about is what's important about the makeup of the people that are going to be making that decision.
As far as the learning outcomes and what's included within your program?
Yeah, and it's actually across the university, it will be.
Yeah.
It's being looked at right now.
Mhm.
And so that could be another conversation offline, but just I'd love to have many of your thoughts over the course of time about what's important there, because I think that's going to be very critical as to whether they're effective.
Mhm. Yeah, and you raise a really great point. You know, the thing about learning outcomes is they really do need to be customizable to the particular program you're working with. What you as a program leader want your students to be able to do is going to inform how you approach designing your learning outcomes. And certainly having different voices included, especially in bigger, broader programs, the more voices, the better, is my perspective. So yeah, I'd love to have that conversation too. We can maybe carve out some time to go a little bit more in depth with that. I do want to be mindful of our time here today, and I want to get through a few more of these. Here's the global learning value rubric. So, you know, in the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric, we have intercultural self-awareness or cultural self-awareness, but there's also global self-awareness. And there tends to be a lot of alignment there. So would be really easy to incorporate global self-awareness alongside intercultural or cultural self-awareness. Perspective taking would align really well with empathy, that ability to shift from one worldview to the other worldview from the other rubric as well. So you can, if you're interested in doing that, you can get some practice at finding those kind of natural overlaps. And maybe this could be a good exercise if you're new to this, using rubrics to define learning outcomes. That could be a good exercise to start with something as easy as, relatively easy, as the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric with the global learning value rubric. Where are those overlaps as a way to practice? Now, how do I overlap the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric with my disciplinary learning outcomes? Because that tends to be far more challenging for everyone, including me. And I've been practicing it for a while, but I have to do it with a lot of different disciplines. But for each of you, I see the recurring question and comment, how do I get this to align with my discipline, with what I'm trying to do with my students? And that's going to take some practice. And of course, we can also have some individual conversations as well. There's a teamwork value rubric, maybe interesting to some of you. And the thing I want to get to with each of these is building custom rubrics. You might want to have multiple competencies and you might want to build rubrics around broader programs. But I'm showing you this not to suggest that you all should be tackling something this robust at this point, but more to show you what's possible. So beginning with your context, what are your needs? Think about your course discipline. Do you want to include social justice? Do you want to include teamwork? Or are you looking at your academic field more broadly? And incorporating intercultural competence, of course, but do you want to bring literacy into that? There's digital literacy, there's all. So think about those different things that you're incorporating in your program. And that's your starting point for how do I get these things to overlap? Where are the natural kind of organic overlaps so that I'm not forcing things into my program that don't really make sense to the students? Because if they don't make sense to you, they're definitely not going to make sense to the students. And again, you can incorporate other rubrics. It doesn't have to be the ones that I've shown you. And certainly rubrics and frameworks from your own discipline, you should definitely be examining those and kind of picking them apart as well. And kind of an easy entry to this is just examine the language and the concepts. Are there specific words and phrases that one-to-one correlate between more than one framework? That's an easy way to make connections and then build off of that. So again, I'm going to show you something. This is not something I would expect anyone to aim for, but I just want to show it as an example of what's possible. So years ago, I took a number of these rubrics and I color coded all down here which ones they are. It's probably difficult to read on the screen, but I've got the global learning rubric, foundation and skills rubric, integrative learning, the intercultural knowledge and competence rubric, teamwork rubric, and I combine them all together. And here the color coding is to show you I pulled this phrase from this rubric and this phrase from that rubric to create what I affectionately refer to as the Franken rubric. And I created it for a teamwork certificate program that I ran for a few years. And it was to find an alignment between a number of different rubrics because there was no one rubric that was really meeting the needs for what I was trying to create for my students. Again, I spent months doing something like this. You will probably don't have months to work on creating a customized rubric, but I do want you to know what's possible. And there are different approaches to this. And looking through these approaches might help you even when you're just working on that one learning outcome, intercultural learning outcome, and fitting it with your disciplinary outcomes. So just thinking about it in this big picture might help you with developing something specific to one learning outcome intersecting with your program, your disciplinary program. So these are some questions to think about. What are the purpose? What is the content? Foundation and perspectives, where are they coming to this? Your learners, where are they coming to it from? All of these different things should be considered in developing this. Now, when we do that, how do we align these outcomes? So one of the questions I want you all to really think about and answer for And you may have been presented with this question when you first came to your supervisor and said, I want to create a study abroad. What's your justification for taking students abroad? Why that specific place? And why is it important that you go there? What is it about being there that can't be done here? I mean, we have technology, we can do virtual exchange, we can talk to people from other countries remotely. What is it about that location? Why do you want to go there with your students? What is it that you want your students to get out of it? And I've got to be honest with you, I've met with faculty and staff program leaders who didn't have an answer. They said, well, I like that country and I thought my students might enjoy it. And, maybe the closest thing I could get to them giving a reason was, oh, well, there's a company that is headquartered there. And I thought we'd go on a tour of their company headquarters and meet with people there. And I was like, okay, well, that's your intersection. Okay, that makes sense. But we need to drill down to that. What is the reason that we want our students to go to this place? What is it about that location and being there physically, especially today, being there physically that they can't get from doing it remotely or doing it here on Purdue's campus in West Lafayette? Try to come up with a good response to those two questions. Something else that's worth figuring out as you're designing learning outcomes is, how do you define each of these concepts? I find a lot of times people come into intercultural competence really only with a frame of understanding multicultural or cross-cultural concepts, right? Multicultural meaning diversity. We're bringing a lot of different cultural groups together, and the focus tends to be on tolerance. Cross-culture is culture A, culture B. We're in culture A and we're trying to learn about culture B, right? And that's definitely useful information, but it's only one component of intercultural competence and intercultural learning. So when we talk about intercultural, it's really this back and forth of two or more cultures. And it tends to focus on these knowledges, skills, and attitudes that are universal, but have different expressions from one culture to the next. What does it mean to do global learning versus intercultural learning? And how do we define diversity? So these are things that we at some point need to better understand, even if it's just looking up a definition of these and trying to, internalize those definitions, and then begin to explore, what is it I want my students to learn about this? So what are the global and international contexts of your discipline, of your program, of your course? So whatever you're teaching, if you're teaching math, what is that international context of your math class, right? Where is that intersection? Is it historical figures in math from, figures from Italy's history that were important to mathematics? That's one example, but you need to explore that more closely. How do you justify inclusion of learning outcomes to your students? So how do you help your students understand why it's important to learn these things? And then where do you place these intercultural learning outcomes within your curriculum, within your program? Where does it make the most sense? Again, we want to look for those organic, natural intersections, not just forcing it in there. Here's another activity to do that is completely unrelated to everything else we've been doing. Students are not going to buy into that. They're going to see it as busy work. Specifying outcomes. So I alluded to this earlier. So once you identify a competency, for example, you need to identify what proficiency level you want your students to reach. So what's a reasonable target over the duration of your program or course? So many of you might be doing a 7 or 10-day program. Do you have pre-departure time to work with your students? Will you have return activities after they come back? So what is your time frame that you're trying to work with? And that might also inform what proficiency level you want them to move. And I would say for most of us, identifying one competency at a particular level is, I think most of my students are here and I want to move them at least one. I particularly like Addison's idea. He was shooting for one higher and hoping that those that are maybe lower would still attain that, if not all the way up. And the thing about this, I want to emphasize is we're setting goals for our programs with the learning outcome and a particular proficiency level. It's okay if we don't hit them. right? Especially if this is your first time designing this program, you might have missed the mark on where your students are starting. So maybe you need to adjust that for the next group of students. So we're kind of shooting in the dark at first, and then as we learn more, we're better informed about setting those proficiency levels. Don't worry, no one's going to slap anybody on the wrist for not meeting your goals with intercultural competence. It's more about the attempt than it is the success. Okay. So what are your all's thoughts? And I'm going to open this up to the floor about choosing a rubric or framework, about selecting proficiency levels. Does anyone have questions or comments? See Andrew's hand shot up right away.
Yeah, Dan, I have a question. If you could just say a little something or someone about the difference between teaching to a level on a rubric versus teaching to change in a rubric. So if you don't know the sort of incoming group, or your group maybe is at different levels of a particular scale, is it okay to sort of set your level at the top and say, I'm going to assess how much people move along? Or when is it appropriate to say, no, I need everybody to at least get to level 2, and that's all I'm going to look for? So thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this gets to, many of us were recruiting students, and sure, for some of us, those might be students we already have in a class and we may be familiar with them, but it may be a population of students we have no experience with. They're coming to us completely blind as far as any information we might have about them. So how do we set that proficiency level? And this might be a point where you may want to incorporate some assessment early on to figure out where your students are. So we often do pre-post and recommend that program leaders use a pre-post model for assessment. That can certainly, with quantitative data assessments, that can help us determine if there is growth across the duration of our program, but it also gives us a starting point. You can also use it as formative assessment, where you're introducing these concepts, you're figuring out where your student's proficiency level is, but at the same time informing them about these concepts and helping them develop further. But to your question, Andrew, sometimes we do start with kind of an arbitrary, I think we want to start with this proficiency level and see how that goes, right? And there's no rule that says we can't adjust that level as we're moving through. A lot of times we'll be looking at different intercultural activities, just like the ones we've done up till now and workshop 1. And if you were in workshop 2, but certainly also today, these activities can be used at different level of proficiency. It's mostly how you debrief them, how you facilitate those conversations after they've done that initial activity. So there can be some kind of adjustments as you go along, but certainly pre-assessments at the beginning of your program to identify a proficiency level can be a very useful tool. So you might identify a competency and narrow it down to kind of a range of proficiency level, then administer that pre-assessment and say, okay, now I know where my students are. Now I can proceed with how I'm going to facilitate the activities that I've selected. And maybe I need to rethink 1 or 2 of those activities and maybe put something else in their place. Mikey?
I have a simple question. It might cause a complicated answer, I don't know, but based on what I've seen with the rubric versus the assessment, what's the difference between the two? I thought that a rubric was part of an assessment. I mean, I know we might talk about that in the next workshop, but.
Absolutely. That's a great segue into the next workshop 5 for those of you who are moving on from 3 to, sorry, not 5. From 3 to 5. We are going to talk about using rubrics as assessment, and that is also how they're being used. So it's a little bit of both. So we're selecting a proficiency level as a goal, but then we're also using the rubric to say, well, this particular student artifact, if we're looking at an essay, for example, are they making statements that are more at level 2, or are they making them more at level 3? And that can be part of that. And kind of going back to Andrew's question about teaching to a specific level, the change to a level. If we identify our students are at level 2, we want them to get to level 3. We start looking at what are those characteristics of level 3 and how do I get them to that, right? So if it's begins to recognize and I want to get them to begins to articulate, what is that difference between recognizing a cultural aspect and articulating an understanding of it? How do I get them to that point? So teaching to that level can be part of that as well. And then that is then collected through essays and qualitative data. You can examine that using the same rubrics as well. So we're definitely going to talk about that in the assessments workshop. We've gone over time. I'll stick around for a few more minutes if anybody else has questions. Thank you all.
Thank you for answering my question, by the way. I just wanted to know what the difference was, but thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the next one. So I'll understand it a lot better as a whole. Thank you.
Great. So thank you all, everybody, for a wonderful conversation today. Like I said, I'll stick around a little bit longer. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Oh, one last thing I do want to note before everybody departs. Please be sure you're staying on top of those discussion boards and tasks and Brightspace. If you missed anything, you can go back and get those. And I think that's it. But have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.